Hello, everyone. Welcome to this member-exclusive webinar on September 17th. This webinar is dedicated to the most recent research project, an area-directed research project I'll be telling you a little bit more about, and you'll hear from Eric Lyman, our primary researcher. I just want to let everybody know that you are on mute. You are muted. If you have so we're going to hold all the questions until after Eric has made his presentation. But then I'm going to unmute everybody. We're not such a large group that will present a problem. I'm going to unmute everybody. What that will allow you to do is unmute yourself. I'll unmute you from the server side, but then you'll have to unmute yourself to speak. So just going to give you a couple minutes about the research committee and how we've done these projects. So, and then I'll let Eric continue. The area research, one of the reasons for the existence of the research committee is to run these projects twice a year. We solicit ideas from our members, kind of a ballot. We ask people to submit ideas in a form, and then we take all those ideas and present them and pitch them to the membership. All of the members in the sponsor, contributor, and non-commercial segments can vote. So by this democratic process, we choose one topic that will receive some funding. This funding comes from member dues. So the member whose topic won the vote has to provide some assistance as we prepare the call for proposals, and we choose a research supplier. At the end of the project, the intellectual property belongs to the research, to the area, but is provided to all members. So in a visual way, that this is the process that we use. The topics are nominated. Voting is the method that we use to choose one topic. We issue the request for proposals, select one research, and award that proposal to the best company. And for just to look back at the past projects that we have done, we've completed all of these projects for the members and continue to work on new ones as we speak. So this is where I have the pleasure of handing it over to Eric Lyman. And Eric, would you tell us a little more about yourself? And I'll be happy to advance the slides while you're speaking.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Christine. First of all, thank you to everybody really for selecting me as the researcher for this project and giving me the opportunity to do the research and to work with many of you. Especially thanks to those who were very proactive in offering their help and agreeing to be interviewed by me and going through the tedious task of answering all of my many questions about your organization and how you use your 3D assets. It's been a pleasure. Yeah, my background, so I am working at 3XR. We are a e-commerce servicing company focusing on VR and AR graphics for enterprise as well. We're currently building out a platform that we use to facilitate the creation and management of these assets and also the deployment and the capturing analytics on the use. So if you want to know more about 3XR, you can just pop over to 3xr.com. Or you can ask me in a follow-up email. Be more than happy to talk to you more about it. My role there is as the director of 3D technology. So a lot of my day-to-day is focused on how we're going to be doing things in the future. So research and development, that kind of thing. And my background is as a 3D artist and also as a manager later. Got my start in the film industry, working with 3D graphics for companies like DreamWorks Animation. Later worked at the Lego company in Europe, also focusing on 3D graphics, that time for digital Lego pieces. And then more recently worked at Wayfair, the large e-commerce home goods company, with the 3D graphics initiative they have, and then to 3XR. So that's a bit about me in a nutshell. The focus of this paper, as you probably know by now, is reusing 3D assets for augmented reality and VR uses in enterprise companies and enterprise workspaces specifically. That is actually not a trivial thing this day and age because we have a moderately long history of using 3D graphics in enterprise, primarily with CAD data, but the use of those graphics, or sorry, the use of those assets in more novel 3D uses like AR and VR is actually quite new. And we run into a lot of incompatibilities when we think about that. The data is traditionally prepared for engineering. It's very mathematical in scope and not very congruent with a lot of the devices that you want to use those things on, like VR goggles or like a HoloLens AR device. So there's this natural incompatibility and therefore cost and kind of a problem associated with reusing those assets. So the scope of the work really was to take a broad look at a lot of the area members' enterprise uses for 3D and compare that with the type of formats they're using, and also a selection of AR devices that they should be used on. And the question really is, how do you get this to go into that? They don't really fit. You've got a square peg you're trying to shove through a circular hole. So what is the solution? And to that extent, I took a pretty wide-ranging look at the solutions that are available today, including some that you may be familiar with, and some that you're not familiar with, to try to come up with a survey, if you will, of these tools and do a qualitative and a quantitative measurement on the effectiveness of these tools to come up with a solution that is workable. Yeah, so I think we can go to the next slide. Yeah, okay, well, I've kind of already gone over some of these questions, but on the right-hand side, there's a list of the outputs that I was commissioned to create, which is a full overview of all the steps, a lot of tables and graphs that show these things, that show how they're measurable and how I measured them. An analysis of the existing tools, the pros and cons. If you've looked at the research paper, you'll see there's a glossary, there is an executive summary, and there is a rather wordy and lengthy video that I created that ended up being about 50 minutes, although I intended it to be 15 minutes. So I'll try to be I'll try to be shorter on this call. Yep, I think we can go to the next slide. So the tools that were in scope for testing are, as you see here, Instalod, MeshLab, the Rapid Compact tool by DDG. I think that you're familiar with this one. Also Pixies or PyXYZ, I'm not sure how to actually say that correctly. Simplygon, which is owned by Microsoft. AR Visio, which is also a part of this association. And then Blender. And I wanted to call out Blender on this slide really quick. It was brought to my attention in a question from one of the members that Blender seemed to have a different rating than the other tools. And that's actually because in this case, I used Blender as my control. And so this was a tool, it's a tool that's completely manual in nature. It's a 3D content creation tool, similar to 3D Studio Max. And it was used by real people doing all the work manually. And the reason that was included in the research was to give a little bit of context and a baseline to compare against when we think about these more automatic tool chains. So in that sense, the grading for that tool was slightly different. For example, the best example is when I rated file compatibility for the tool. I gave it the best possible score because anything that we wanted to put into it, we could put into it, but only because we had people to actually come up with a solution to find out creative ways to get that file format into Blender. So I didn't grade it the same way as I would have graded Pixies, for example. So I could have made that more clear in the paper, but I just wanted to call that out now to everybody. Okay,
Could you
we can go to
also
the next slide.
explain, Eric, could you also explain how you chose these? Because I think in the report you also have a few others that were not examined at the same level of detail.
That's right. Yeah. So the approach for selecting tools was really a composite of talking to the area members to see which tools were already on their radar. It was also looking out into the industry on my own and doing my own research. but of course also based on my own experience. Some of these tools I had run into before, and I knew that they were quite effective for what they were supposed to do. That's pretty much how I chose these. So here is a visual overview of the assets that I put through the different tool chains for testing. If you look in the report, you can see I have a lot of more qualitative data on each of these, or I should say quantitative data on each of these. So in terms of how dense the meshes are, what type of files they are. But I'm intending this presentation to be a little bit more visual in nature, since you already have all the details in the report. But these are the 9 assets that I chose to test. And the primary criteria for choosing these were based on visual complexity, the complexity of the 3D model, and also file type. So I was trying to get as many different file types as I could, especially those that were called out by area members. But also I wanted to make sure that I captured things that were not easy in nature necessarily. Even that green panel on the middle left is not strictly simple, even though it looks like it is, because it does have a lot of intricate beveling work that oftentimes will become garbled or just not come out very well when you're thinking about automatic tool chains. I also made sure to include a couple of point clouds. You can see that one in the middle. That's from the Newport News shipbuilding company. And then I've got a point cloud of an object, which is this bunny statue, which is has actually quite a lifespan outside of this paper, but it's a model that's been around in the open domain for a while. We also have some organic material on the top right with a skull that came from Medtronic. And that one was especially difficult for some of the tool chains because the nature of this file was from scan data. And when you're talking about scan data, you're not talking about a very automatic capture of a shape, which means you have a lot of messy data. So a lot of the points and vertices and faces were completely overlapping, and that caused problems for some tool chains, and other tool chains did quite well. And then I've got an engine block because I felt that was fairly complicated. It actually turned out to be less complicated than I thought for the tool chains. One of the most complicated assets here is actually in the middle top, the 3D printer. And that's because it had a lot of different little moving parts, and it had a lot of disparate parts. So it's not just one solid thing like a statue. It's actually these little tiny pieces that have space between them. And that caused problems for almost every tool chain I looked at. So it was fun to pick out these horrendous models, if you will, because I knew that it would cause a lot of problems, but it would also give a lot of meaning to the paper because from the outset, we wanted to choose things that were difficult. We didn't want to just choose things that were easy. The theory here being that if you can do something difficult, you can do something easy. So we want to know about the difficult models. Yep. Okay, I think we can go to the next slide. So the grading here, this is my grading system for the assets and therefore for the tool chains themselves. Using these 6 sub-grading scores, I was able to derive an overall score, but essentially going from top to bottom, looking at visual fidelity, I'm just trying to see how good the model looks, which is actually different from how similar to the original the model looks. Something can be more similar and actually look a little bit less good, and vice versa. Something can look good but have no basis in reality. So you can imagine that it's possible to imagine a car that doesn't exist and create a 3D model of it. It would have fantastic visual fidelity, but it wouldn't look anything like it was supposed to look like. So that would actually be a bad thing. Conversion rate was measured on a polygons converted per second. So what I did there is when I had the model loaded into whatever toolchain, I would analyze what the resulting polygon count for that model was. So if it was already a polygon model, that's pretty straightforward. Just take the count. But if it was a CAD model, it would first need to be tessellated down into polygons, and then I would record that. And then however long the tool took to process the mesh would be what I would divide by. So I'd come up with a polygons per second kind of metric. And the reason this is important is because, especially for members here, with with enterprise companies, we're talking about potentially working at scale, and you're going to want to work really quickly and efficiently, even if you have a very powerful computer. You're working with potentially tens of thousands of models, so that's an important factor. But arguably more important is the next one down, which is the manual processing steps. So again, because we're talking about working at scale and working on enterprise data, it's important that whatever we select as our tool chain has to be as automatic as possible, because you don't want to have people on staff necessarily to touch each model. So that was an important one. Then file type compatibility is essentially how many file types can the tool process, or what can it take in without needing an intermediary step to convert to something else, which also kind of speaks to the manual process steps. And then I have an adherence to triangle limitation. So with these assets, I set an ambitious goal of converting down to 30,000 triangles, sticking with one material, and using textures that were no bigger than 1024. And so this was just measuring how well was it able to work within that limitation. And actually all the tools did work pretty well with it. But that's essentially how I graded everything. And at the end, you'll see the overall grading chart. And I show you there's two different ways that I use to calculate the results. But then just briefly on the bottom right, you can see the scoring system is pretty straightforward. Green is good, red is bad, and then we have everything in between. But important to call out that getting a 2 is this minimum viable score. So even that being a 2 and being below the middle is still usable. But really you want to be above that. Ideally, you want to be a 3 or above to have a good result. So, okay, let's go to the next slide. So just a view into my process as I went through this testing. Pretty straightforward, but I'll sort of walk through it. There's two phases, the setup phase and the execution phase. Setup phase is basically making contact with the software vendor, requesting a free license, and then essentially after that, taking time to learn as much as I can about how the tool works, understanding the best practices, going through tutorials and documentation, and hopefully getting very confused and asking questions of the vendor, which is something I tried to do as often as I could. But then once I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of the tool, which would be about a week or week and a half, I would actually go into the work and I would try to take the assets that I had and convert them into something that looked as good as it could look without doing anything too extra special, meaning I tried not to work around the tool. I tried not to, it's not like cheating in that sense, but I tried to stay true to the tool itself and use it like anybody else would, but to the best of my skill that I had attained in the week and a half. So there is a lot of trial and error in that process. It's essentially just try to take my best stab at it, see the results, and if I didn't like the results, I would go back and try to tweak it. Using that process, I was able to get some looking very good. Sometimes I was not able to make progress, and I had to just move on from the asset. And so also important to note that when I would get stuck on a certain asset, I did try to reach out to the vendors and try to reach out to their specialists just to make sure that I wasn't doing something wrong. But having said that, it's probably on your mind right now that I'm sure there's things that I did do wrong that did make it into the final paper, just due to human fallibility. I tried my best to make sure that didn't happen, but of course it's a natural outcome of any sort of human creative process. After that, it's a simple matter of exporting the assets, saving them, making sure to record all the metrics while I do so in my Google Sheets. Then I would take those converted assets and I would open them on the destination platforms. So in this case, we're talking about a relatively low-end Google tablet, or sorry, Samsung tablet running an Android operating system. I opened it up on my iPad Pro from 2018. And then we also had an Oculus Quest and a HoloLens 2 that I would open these up on. And essentially what I'm looking for at that stage is just making sure that it came in okay, that it looks like I expect it to look, that there are no performance issues, and then recording screenshots for the report. Yeah, and then after that, it's a matter of saving all that data and then tallying the scores for the final report. Okay. let's go to the next slide. So I just want to give you sort of a visual tour and visual walkthrough of the journey that one of the assets had through this testing process. This is a 3D model from the NIST organization. It is a CAD model NX8 format. And this one, I was particularly pleased with this as a selection test asset because although it looks pretty simple, it's actually not. Anytime you have a round shape that's intersecting with an angled shape, you're going to end up with potential artifacts and potential problems with how that looks. And there's also a lot of small, medium, and large details on this object. So I felt if the tools could handle this pretty well, then I would feel pretty confident for this type of shape. So, so let's go to the next slide. Here you can see a screenshot of what the asset looked like after it was converted from its native CAD format into a polygon mesh in each of these tools. So you'll notice that it does look slightly different across each of these because each tool has its own interface, its own default lighting and material kind of work. Just a quick note, the Blender one, again, that is a manually created asset. So that was created by somebody manually pulling in the CAD data and essentially tracing over it in the 3D modeling process. But everything else here was automatically derived and automatically converted by these tools. And by and large, most of these tools did a pretty good job. There is a small detail on this model that didn't make it into some of the final models on some of the pipelines. There's a very small logo, the NIST logo on the side, which you can actually see. You can probably barely see it, but if you look at the Mesh Lab screenshot, you'll see there's a little black spot on the middle part. That's the NIST logo. And some tools were able to preserve that data upon conversion. Some didn't preserve it, but created it in the normal map, which was also good. I think actually Instalad was one of the tools that didn't bring it over. And it also didn't show up in our Blender tool. So whoever was creating it, due again to the nature of human perception and fallibility, just left it off. So I thought that was interesting. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. And then here you can see the next step in that process that we looked at before in the flowchart, where I actually brought the assets into augmented reality and put it onto my desk, which was kind of fun. A quick call out here. So the AR Visio and the Rapid Compact screenshots are actually done in the HoloLens 2, because with AR Visio, its intention is to keep the data in the experience. So it was viewed directly through AR Visio on the HoloLens 2. The blue shapes you see there are just just part of the interface. It's not part of the model, so don't get distracted by that. But yeah, you can see most of them came fine in this asset. Just had that different look with the materials and the lighting. Or actually, rather, the lighting is the same because it's all on the same AR platform, but the materials are slightly different. But actually, almost every tool did a pretty good job with this asset. Okay, so look at the next slide. Just some additional thoughts. One thing I was not mindful of when I went through my testing was the scale of the models. So in the case of the skull, it actually came across as like a 3 or 4 foot object in my space and took up almost all of my desk and working area. So just be mindful of working with scale. Probably not something that I need to remind most of you. And then in terms of the file formats, outputs, the 2 that I would recommend, so there were 3 that I worked with, the FBX format, the USDZ format, and GLTF format. And I'd actually recommend either GLTF or USDZ, depending on the platform you intend to use the tool or use the assets on. In the case of the HoloLens 2, the GLTF is just fine. And of course, whenever you work with the Apple ecosystem, you have to use the USDZ because they don't use anything else. These 2 formats I think are the best because at the moment, they're under quite a bit of rapid development and there's a lot of focus on them within the 3D community and the e-commerce community. And so you can expect that there's going to be, the latest technologies going into these formats. For example, a few years ago, the Kronos group implemented, I think it's called the Draco geometry compression algorithm, in GLTF, which gave a tremendous savings on file size. So those things are really important, I think, if you want to stay abreast of the latest technology and using the latest and greatest features for your 3D models. In terms of an intermediary format, I defaulted to FBX quite a bit because FBX has been around for a long time and it enjoys a high degree of compatibility across software toolchains. So I would recommend that. Yeah, and I think that's all I have to say on that slide. And so just to wrap up, this is the overall scoring that I alluded to earlier in the talk here. You can see that I've created a heat map where we've got the assets on the left-hand side. We have the tool chains running across the top from left to right. And I've essentially used each of those sub criteria that we looked at before to come up with an average. I do want to call out here that in my grading, I made no attempt to do a weighted average because I felt like producing a weighted average where I put greater emphasis on visual fidelity over, say, conversion speed would give an inaccurate picture for this research itself. However, when you think about your own organization, very likely you will want to weight those scores yourself and perhaps produce different results to know which tool is the best for you and for your organization. For example, if you really need to have the very best quality, but you don't care about speed, then you can adjust those scores to be weighted differently. And in the report itself, I've broken down each subscore into its own table, just like this. So you can go back and reference and see which one performs better. And then just one last thing I'll say here. There are two tallied scores at the bottom. You have an average score and an overall average score. And the difference here is that the average score only averages those fields which have a result. So for example, with Instalod, the MX trailer and bunny assets are point clouds, which is actually incompatible with the tool. So in the average score, I've taken those out. However, for the overall average score, I have included those in. So you could say that the overall score is the most subjective, but the average score may be more meaningful. I know those two things sound like they're a contradiction, but that's kind of how I thought about this to give the most complete picture possible. Yeah, and I think that's all I have to say for now. But I'll be more than happy to attempt to answer your questions.
Thank you, Eric. There is one question that was submitted through the control panel, so I'll ask that. And while I'm reading that to you, I'm going to unmute everybody. So all of the participants now can unmute themselves and spontaneously ask questions. But first, let me convey Tony Hodgson's question to you, Eric, about scale. Mm-hmm. And Tony says he would have thought that the default scale of a model would be part of the metadata and that it would actually stay with the model through the conversion. I would expect a human skull to be about human size versus the giant one in your picture. Why is that? Is scale treated in a 3D model differently, or can you answer that, please?
That's a really good question. I don't think that it's quite that deep in this case, actually. The scale at which it was scanned is likely unknown and perhaps not wasn't a consideration. We'd have to ask the team who did it at Medtronic, I suppose. But likely it was an arbitrary scale that it was scanned in at. When you do scan in 3D models like that, scale is not always a consideration. And I think that's how it survived through the conversion process and came in. So essentially the tool didn't destroy that metadata, as it were, it just used it. That's how I see this.
Okay.
I'd like to follow on that if I can.
Mm-hmm.
This is Tony.
Hey.
So if somebody created a 3D model of a washing machine, and then I got that model and had to convert it for whatever my ultimate end purposes would be, I would hope that the scale that was provided with the model is still applicable unless I deliberately change it. And what I think I heard you say is we don't know what scale the skull was originally scanned at. I mean, it was scanned, and do you mean you don't know what scale was associated with that original model? If it was some arbitrary scale, or you don't know that anybody took the time to actually go, okay, now we've resized the scan. However we got the scan, we've resized it so it's now 1-to-1. Here you go.
That's my expectation. Yeah.
Okay. I know Dan has a question. He has several questions.
Cool.
Dan, you can unmute yourself. There you go.
All right. Yeah, I was supplied Eric with a point cloud of a STEM outreach trailer and kind of a dummy example of a ship compartment. And Eric, I was just curious, like that model I sent you was pretty messy. It's 1/3000th of the full model of our product that we produce here, so it's pretty sizable as well. But what was probably your reasons to disregard that as a potential in the research? I know there's probably many, but just curious.
Are you talking about the MX trailer?
No, the JT model that was sent of a ship compartment.
Okay. Yeah, the JT model, I don't actually recall that one. I can't remember if we intentionally left out.
We can't hear you very well.
Oh, am I coming through okay?
Now you are.
Yeah. All I could say with certainty, Dan, is that one thing I wanted to make sure I included was a point cloud representation of an environment and a point cloud representation of an object. And the MX trailer worked out perfectly as a point cloud object, as a point cloud environment. And the bunny was a perfect example of an object. So those were my reasons for including those, at least. I don't think there was a specific reason for excluding the other one you talked about.
Anybody else have any questions, comments, feedback?
Well, I know that several people that I work with are still going over the report, so I appreciate the detail, and I know we all, at least over here at NNS, are enjoying this report, as it's insightful and pretty quantitative. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was a labor of love. Yeah, it was quite intense, but it was an enjoyable experience for me too.
Any other comments or questions for Eric? Well, they are so impressed with what you've done, or they haven't been able to digest it yet, but they really appreciate your synthesizing it. I want to kind of make a couple of comments. One is that in the, I said, what are the outcomes that were actionable from this project? And I think they are that we, in the teams, under the folder for this project within the research committee, we have all of the assets that that were collected by Eric. So if people wanted to repeat any of these things with another tool, they could use the same assets and try other tools that were not included, or maybe an internal and in-house tool that is been developed for this purpose. So we have some assets, and then also I think very importantly is the methodology that that Eric describes and used. He developed it because there was no methodology for how to do this, and in the report he makes it clear that you really do need to try this at home. and that your weights will vary depending on what your priorities are and your business needs.
Mhm.
So I think those are really important things to point out and make sure people are clear about how that works.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that as a starting point, I would highly recommend that you go through that exercise. If not converting the assets yourselves, you can at least go through the subscores and pull out those things which are most meaningful for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, Eric.
Hey, this is Tony.
You're back.
Real quick. I apologize if I missed it, but I didn't hear you say anything about any kind of analysis of cost for these different tools and methods. I recognize you were looking at, you know, how well do they work, but a factor that one might consider is how you pay for this. You know, do you have any advice there, or did you include anything like that in the report?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I actually didn't include anything about cost simply because I recognize that that is something that is potentially subjective. And let me explain what I mean. Whenever you think about cost in these scenarios, you have the actual financial cost. You also have the time cost. I think the time cost is actually the most expensive part of this process potentially. But I think that you have to really think about those two things together to see what's going to work best for you. And that also comes down to the performance of the tool. So I didn't try to synthesize the cost also because I know that when you think about cost with an enterprise company, there's often a lot of room to negotiate. You know, for example, I am the Newport News shipbuilding company. We do this many billions of dollars of business. We can offer to buy this many seats from your company. And therefore the company would be like, well, we'd be happy to give you a 20% discount or something like that. So it would be misleading for me to come up with a metric for cost as a part of this grading, just because it could change wildly from an individual's point of view versus an enterprise company's point of view.
Sure.
But yeah, I appreciate the question. I know where you're coming from. I would say to get a better lead on this, definitely take a look at the performance, look at which tools are the most automatic in nature, and then compare that against like a license cost.
Sure.
You know, I know that the tools often have different costs associated with using an artist seat versus a server seat. That's the case with Installat actually, where the costs of their studio seat for an artist is like $3,000 a year versus the server tool, which is something closer to $100,000 a year. But again, the cost is potentially cheaper with the command line tool anyway, because now you're talking about a tool that can process 10,000 models a night versus your artist who can do one model a week. So I think those are the things to think about.
Yeah, that's good point. I also noticed that, shifting gears, I also noticed you limited your models to one texture. I'm wondering if adding the additional textures would change the results at all, or that's just going to kind of be a linear change across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that actually instead of adding additional textures, just increasing the texture resolution from 1024 to 2048 will give you a substantial leap in quality. But then of course your file size goes up, but that may not be a problem for your organization. So yeah, and also increasing the polygon budget. So 30,000 was quite ambitious for some of the models, particularly the Honda engine block and the 3D printer. The 3D printer actually just didn't come out well with 30,000 at all. So you're going to need at least 100,000 for that model. But you know, depends on how you're going to be using them too. So.
Dan,
Yeah,
I see your hand is raised. Did you have anything? Did you want to come back in, or is that left over?
Yeah, I was going to ask, you know, building out to the head-mounted systems, the VR, Oculus Quest, and the HoloLens. It may be in your report, and I just hadn't seen it. But did you notice any performance issues, loss of frame rate, anything that made you, if you weren't doing a across-the-board controlled experiment that you would like to take it further in the optimization process, or did everything run really smoothly with the optimizations that you did in the experiments?
Yeah, I would say actually everything worked out pretty smoothly with the test assets I was creating, but that's also owing to the fact that they were so relatively lightweight, or in other words, I'd put such a high bar for the tools to convert to. 30,000 polygons with a 1024 texture and one material is no problem for today's technology. I think if you want to push it further, what I would try doing is either taking those assets and loading 10 of them up and see what happens, or convert them yourself and try to convert to like 100,000 or 200,000 poly limit, and then just see where it breaks.
Or in the case of the Arvisio, it would scale. It wouldn't break eventually. It would just go on forever.
Right, right.
On the HoloLens. Thanks, Dan. Thank you, Tony. Anybody else? I think this is a wrap. Eric, excellent project. Thank you so much for all of your dedication and the excellent product.
Yeah,
it's going to be a lot for people to chew on over the next weeks and months. So don't be surprised if you hear more questions coming up.
Yeah, and if I can help with any other questions that come up in the meanwhile, you can always reach out to my email, and I'll be happy to help out when I can.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric.
Cool.
Very nice job. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate your attending.
Thank you.
Have a nice afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.